There are two kinds of men who write about power. The first kind writes from inside it, a king's chancellor, a general, a pope's cousin. The second kind writes from outside a locked door, pressing an ear to the wood, and describing what he hears with a precision that unsettles everyone who has never had to listen that closely. The man history remembers as the great teacher of tyranny belonged to the second kind. He never ruled a city. He never commanded an army of his own. He held no title higher than a mid-level clerk in a government that collapsed twice during his lifetime, and both times it collapsed without him. And yet 400 years later, in the private libraries of presidents, in the marked-up paperbacks of generals, in the study notes of men who have actually held the kind of power he only ever watched, his name still appears, not as a curiosity, as a warning label. He was arrested on suspicion of a conspiracy he almost certainly had no part in. He was hoisted by a rope tied behind his own bound wrists until his shoulders came apart in their sockets, and he confessed to nothing, because there was nothing to confess. He spent the last 15 years of his life exiled from the government he loved, writing letter after letter to men who would not answer them, begging for a job that never came. This is the man later centuries would call an advocate of murder, of deceit, of the naked worship of power for its own sake. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and the question this story asks is not whether he was right. The question is stranger than that. Was The Prince a confession of what power actually requires, or was it something closer to an act of revenge, written by a man locked outside the room his entire life, while describing exactly how the door works so that no one inside it could ever again pretend otherwise? Get comfortable. This is a long story, and it rewards patience. We begin on the banks of the river Arno, in the spring of 1469. Florence in 1469 is a city drunk on its own genius. Brunelleschi's dome has stood on the cathedral for over 30 years, a feat of engineering no one else in Europe can explain. Painters walk its streets who will be remembered 1,000 years from now. And into a crowded house on the south bank of the Arno, shared by 4 branches of one family and some 30 relatives, a boy is born who will outlast almost all of them in the memory of history, though not for the reasons his father hoped. His father, Bernardo, is a lawyer who cannot practice law. Bernardo was born outside marriage, and Florentine law does not allow illegitimate men full citizenship. Worse, Bernardo has fallen into debt, and Florentine statute bars the sons of debtors from holding public office. Before Niccolò can walk, the city has already written him out of the future his family's name should have guaranteed him. He will grow up inside one of Florence's oldest and proudest families, surrounded by books, by Latin verses, by his father's stubborn love of antiquity, and he will grow up knowing, with the particular clarity of a child who has been told no before he understood why, that the doors of power are not open to men like him. Consider what this does to a mind built early enough on that knowledge. A boy who watches the machinery of the state from a house that produces lawyers and bankers but cannot itself hold office develops a different relationship with power than a boy born to inherit it. He does not romanticize it. He studies it, the way a man studies a lock he is not permitted to own the key to. His education is classical. Cicero, Livy, Virgil, translated and retranslated at his teacher's insistence, always with an eye toward the practical, toward the letters a future clerk might need to write. War disrupts his schooling more than once. In the year 1478, a failed plot against the ruling Medici family drags Florence into war with the Pope, and Bernardo, his income cut by the fighting, is forced to economize on his son's tutors. A year later, plague reaches the city, and young Niccolò is sent to the countryside while his father stays behind and very nearly dies of the disease himself. By the time Niccolò reaches his university years, he has learned 2 lessons that will define everything he later writes. The first is that the men who talk about virtue the loudest are rarely the men who understand how cities actually survive. The second is quieter and more dangerous. that being shut out of a system does not stop a man from understanding it better than the men inside it. It only sharpens the eye. Florence will spend the next 20 years proving him right, city block by city block, war by war. And the boy locked out by law is about to be handed, by pure accident of collapse, the very office his birth was supposed to deny him. To understand how a disqualified young man becomes one of the most important officials in Florence, you first have to understand how unstable the ground beneath Florence has become. This is a city that calls itself a republic while being run, almost entirely without formal office, by one family's money. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, dies in 1492, leaving behind 3 sons and a system of informal control that depends entirely on the personal skill of whoever holds it. His heir, Piero, does not have that skill. 2 years later, the French King Charles VIII marches an army into Italy to press a dynastic claim on Naples, and Piero de' Medici, without so much as asking Florence's ruling council, surrenders to him outright. You have to picture what this means to a proud, mercantile city that has spent 60 years pretending it still governs itself. The humiliation is instant. The Florentines rise up, throw Piero out of the city, and are left holding a republic with no idea how to run one. Into that vacuum steps a priest. Girolamo Savonarola preaches from the cathedral pulpit that the French invasion is God's punishment for Florentine vanity. And for 4 years the city burns its own paintings, its own poetry, its own musical instruments in public bonfires meant to cleanse it of sin. It is a strange, feverish interregnum, a city trying to purify itself into strength instead of building strength the ordinary way, through soldiers and treasuries and alliances that do not depend on divine favor. It cannot last. When Savonarola's foreign protector abandons him, his enemies in the church and in Florence itself move quickly. On the 23rd of May, 1498, Savonarola and 2 of his closest allies are hanged and burned in the same piazza where the bonfires once stood. This is the world Machiavelli enters. Not a stable state making room for a promising young clerk, but a wounded, frightened city that has just watched 2 governing philosophies fail in a row: the personal rule of a princely family and the theocratic fervor of a prophet. What Florence wants now, urgently, is a compromise no faction can claim as its own. It wants an outsider, and the young man whose family has been legally excluded from office his entire life is, for the first time, exactly what the moment requires. Not despite his position outside the old networks of power, but because of it. You have likely felt some version of this yourself, even if the stakes were smaller. The moment an institution has just failed twice in a row is the moment it stops trusting its insiders and starts looking, almost desperately, for someone who has never had the chance to fail it before. Florence, in 1498, is looking. 29 years old, with no legal standing, no diplomatic experience, and no faction behind him, Niccolò Machiavelli is about to become one of the most important men in the government of Florence. And he is about to discover that watching power from outside a locked door taught him almost nothing about what it feels like to hold the key. On the 19th of June 1498, Machiavelli is appointed second Chancellor of the Florentine Republic. The title sounds modest: a writer of official letters, a keeper of records for the council responsible for war and diplomacy. It is not modest in practice. Within weeks, he is drafting instructions to ambassadors, managing correspondence with mercenary captains, and being sent, personally, into rooms where the fate of his city is being negotiated by men who owe Florence nothing. His first missions are almost comic in their powerlessness. He is dispatched to negotiate with a mercenary captain who simply refuses to fight. He travels to meet Caterina Sforza, the fierce regent of Forli, and returns having secured nothing at all. But watch what he does with these failures, because this is the method that will define the rest of his life. He does not simply report what happened. He begins compiling patterns: which threats worked, which promises were kept, which men could be trusted only as far as their own interest extended and not one step further. In March of 1500, he is sent to France to make Florence's case to King Louis XII. It does not go well. The French are demanding money Florence does not have, insisting the city continue paying for Swiss mercenaries who had mutinied and abandoned an entire siege. Machiavelli, holding no authority to negotiate the terms himself, can only write home for instructions, while the cardinal advising the king treats Florentine dignity as an afterthought. He returns from this mission with an idea that will not leave him for the rest of his career. A city that cannot fight its own wars will always be a supplicant in someone else's throne room. Mercenaries fight for pay, not for Florence. Allies fight for their own advantage, not for Florence. A republic that depends on rented loyalty is a republic perpetually one betrayal away from ruin. It is worth pausing on what this actually looked like from the ground, rather than from the council chamber. Picture a Florentine envoy, polished Latin, careful manners, a man raised on Cicero, standing in a French court where his host city's survival is being haggled over like a shipment of wool. No one in that room owes Florence anything. No one is obligated to keep a promise made to a smaller power. Machiavelli sits through this humiliation more than once, in more than one court, and each time the lesson calcifies a little further. Virtue does not win negotiations. Leverage wins negotiations. A prince, or a republic, that relies on the goodwill of others has already lost, whether it knows it yet or not. This is the first taste of real influence Machiavelli ever has. Not command, but proximity. He cannot make Florence strong. He can only watch, exactly and coldly, what strength and its absence actually look like at the negotiating table, and begin building, letter by letter, report by report, the framework of a philosophy that will outlive every king he ever begged for mercy. By 50-01, married now to Marietta Corsini in a partnership that will prove steadier than any alliance he negotiates for Florence, Machiavelli has become something more specific than a clerk. He has become the man Florence sends when the situation is already bad. Pistoia is tearing itself apart in factional street violence, and Machiavelli is sent to broker peace between men who would rather kill each other than compromise. Arezzo rebels, and Machiavelli studies exactly how quickly a subject city turns on its ruler the moment that ruler looks weak. And in October of 1502, Florence sends him to a meeting that will shape the rest of his intellectual life. A negotiation with Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, in the city of Imola. Here is the system Machiavelli begins to see whole for the first time. Not fragments of diplomacy glimpsed from outside, but an entire architecture of state building, assembled in front of him by a man with none of Florence's inherited legitimacy and all of its missing decisiveness. Cesare Borgia has no ancient claim to the territories he rules. He has conquered them, city by city, through the Romagna, and he is holding them together through a combination of calculated cruelty, careful reputation management, and a willingness to act the instant circumstances demand it, not the week after. Machiavelli watches him negotiate from a position of near total isolation, abandoned at various points by the Pope, by the French king, by his own mercenary captains, and somehow keep multiplying his territory anyway. What Machiavelli is building, section by section in his own mind, is a working model of a state that does not rely on inheritance, custom, or divine favor to survive. It relies on the systematic application of whatever the moment requires. Borgia's mercenary captains, sensing his growing strength, conspire against him. Borgia does not retaliate in fury. He waits, negotiates, appears to forgive them, lures them back into his service under the pretense of reconciliation, and then, in December of 1502, has them arrested. Machiavelli watches the entire operation unfold at close range, close enough to write home in real time, describing exactly how it is being done. This is the moment the audience has been waiting for, whether they knew it or not, the mid-story revelation that reframes everything before it. Machiavelli is not simply collecting anecdotes about ruthless men, he is reverse engineering the machinery of the state itself, separating what actually holds power together from the myths that surround it. Legitimacy, he is beginning to conclude, is not something a prince is born with or granted by God. It is something built, continuously, out of decisive action, calculated fear, and the careful management of what other people believe about you. You have felt a version of this system yourself, even if you never named it. Every institution you have ever dealt with, a company, a government office, a neighborhood association, runs partly on formal rules and partly on an invisible architecture of who actually holds leverage over whom. Machiavelli is the first man to write that architecture down without pretending it does not exist. And the man who taught him how to see it, more than any other, is about to give him the material for the darkest and most instructive scene in his entire diplomatic career. Before the story moves further, it is worth sitting inside the worldview Machiavelli is assembling, on its own terms, without rushing to condemn it. This is the section the audience will disagree with most, and the section that will teach them the most, if they let it. Classical philosophy, from Plato through Cicero, insists that a ruler who is genuinely virtuous, generous, merciful, honest, will ultimately be the most secure ruler, because virtue itself commands loyalty. Machiavelli looked at the actual record of Italian politics in his own lifetime and concluded this was a comforting lie. Princes who tried to rule by textbook virtue kept losing their states to men who did not. Piero de' Medici, gentle and unprepared, lost Florence in a single summer. Soft rulers across Italy were devoured, one after another, by harder ones. Machiavelli's own diplomatic reports are full of the same observation repeated in different words. The world does not reward the ruler you wish existed. It rewards the ruler who can read a situation correctly and act on that reading without hesitation. From this observation, Machiavelli builds his most controversial and most misunderstood idea: virtue. It is not virtue in the Christian or classical sense. It is closer to a ruler's total capacity, his boldness, his adaptability, his willingness to do what the moment requires, even when it violates conventional morality. A prince with virtue can be generous or cruel, merciful or savage, honest or deceptive, entirely as circumstances demand. And none of these choices are good or bad in themselves. They are only effective or ineffective. Machiavelli's famous uncomfortable line, that it is safer to be feared than loved, if a prince cannot be both, is not a celebration of cruelty. It is an observation about reliability. Love, he argues, is maintained by a bond of gratitude that self-interested men break the instant it becomes inconvenient. Fear is maintained by the much more dependable mechanism of consequence. Opposite virtue stands fortuna, fortune, chance, the unpredictable current of events no ruler fully controls. Machiavelli pictures fortune as a river that floods without warning, and argues that the difference between rulers who survive it and rulers who are swept away is not luck itself, but preparation. A prince who builds dikes before the flood arrives, who arms his own citizens rather than renting foreign soldiers, who studies history rather than trusting providence, can absorb what fortune throws at him. A prince who waits for divine favor drowns. This is the intellectual scaffolding beneath everything Machiavelli will write for the rest of his life, and it asks something specific of anyone listening. Not agreement, but the willingness to sit inside a worldview built entirely on consequence rather than intention. He is not telling you murder is good. He is telling you that pretending virtue alone protects a state has gotten a great many good men killed, and he has stopped being willing to look away from that fact. What happens next will show you exactly what that refusal costs. In blood, at a place called Sinigalia. Zoom out first. By the final weeks of 1502, Cesare Borgia's captains, the same men whose loyalty had begun to waver, the same men Machiavelli watched him court back into apparent friendship, have become a liability he can no longer tolerate. They command troops he needs. They also know, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how ruthless he is capable of being, which makes them dangerous the moment his back is turned. Borgia does not move against them in open battle. He does something colder. He proposes reconciliation. He sends warm assurances. He invites his former captains, among them Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo, to meet him at the small coastal town of Sinigalia, framing the gathering as the sealing of a renewed alliance. Machiavelli, present in the Romagna as Florence's official observer, is close enough to this unfolding operation to document it almost as it happens. Now zoom in. Picture the narrow streets of a fortified Adriatic town in December, the sea air cold, torches lit along a route the visiting captains believe leads to a diplomatic embrace. They arrive with modest escorts. Trusting the appearance of reconciliation, Borgia has spent weeks constructing. They are received courteously. And then, inside walls they cannot leave, they are seized. Within hours, Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo are dead by strangulation, their army absorbed, their rebellion ended before it can properly begin. Machiavelli's own account of the operation, later circulated as a short clinical report, does not moralize. It describes method. It notes the patience of the deception, the precision of the timing, the totality of the outcome. This is Tactic 7 in practice, whether the audience notices it or not. The moment that invites the easiest condemnation in the entire story is the moment Machiavelli refuses to supply one. He does not write that Borgia was a monster. He writes what Borgia did, and how, and what it accomplished, and lets the facts generate whatever verdict the reader is prepared to reach on their own. Here is the uncomfortable empathy the story asks you to sit with, only for a moment. Put yourself where Borgia stood, not to excuse him, but to understand the calculation. He had watched these same captains conspire against him once already. A prince who forgives a betrayal and does nothing further has taught every ambitious man under his command that betrayal carries no cost. From inside that logic, the deception at Sinigalia is not senseless cruelty. It is the only response consistent with continued survival. That is precisely the discomfort Machiavelli wants his future readers to feel. Not permission, but recognition. You can see exactly how a man arrives at a monstrous choice and still call it, honestly, monstrous. Named Contradiction, the first of three, Cesare Borgia had spent months cultivating a public reputation for magnanimity, for forgiving old enemies, for uniting the Romagna under a rule gentler than the warlords who preceded him. Sinigalia is the same man, using that exact reputation as bait, to murder the men who trusted it. The mercy was real enough to be believed. The murder was real enough to end it. Both were tools, used by the same hand, in service of the same unbroken ambition. And Machiavelli, watching from close enough to write it all down, understood for the first time that this was not hypocrisy. In the logic he was building, it was simply how power actually worked, wherever it survived at all. Sinigalia teaches Machiavelli something practical as well as philosophical, and he spends the following years trying to apply it to Florence itself. The lesson is this: a state that depends on hired soldiers is a state that has outsourced its own survival to men whose loyalty can be bought away by the next bidder. Florence has learned this the hard way, over and over, in failed siege after failed siege against the rebellious port city of Pisa. Mercenary captains stall, hesitate, or simply abandon the field when the fighting turns costly, because dying for Florence was never actually part of their contract. Machiavelli's answer is a citizen militia, ordinary Florentine men, farmers and townsmen, trained and armed to defend their own city because it is their own city, not because they are being paid by the day. It is a radical proposal in a period when professional mercenary companies dominate Italian warfare, and it takes years of persistent lobbying before the Florentine Council approves it. By February of 1506, Machiavelli has 400 recruits marching in formation through the city, wearing iron breastplates, carrying lances and the earliest firearms. Within 3 years, the force numbers 5,000 men. This is escalation with a clear internal logic. Each small success makes the next expansion easier to justify. The militia proves itself first in border skirmishes, then in raids that strip the Pisan countryside of its harvest, starving the rebellious city into surrender. On the 8th of June 1509, Machiavelli marches at the head of his citizen soldiers as Florence finally retakes Pisa after a war that has dragged on, in one form or another, for 15 years. It is the high watermark of his public career, proof, in his own eyes, that a state which trains and trusts its own people can accomplish what money alone cannot buy. You have likely experienced a smaller version of this same acceleration in your own life, the way one success quietly lowers your resistance to the next, larger risk, until momentum itself starts making decisions you would never have made cold. Machiavelli is not immune to this. Emboldened by the militia's success, he pushes Florence toward larger ambitions: cavalry recruitment, expanded fortifications, and eventually a direct role in the tangled wars between France, the papacy, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire that are consuming the Italian peninsula piece by piece. Florence survives one crisis after another. Through the careful diplomacy Machiavelli keeps engineering behind the scenes. A truce here, a delayed alliance there, a militia mobilized just in time. But escalation, in politics as in everything else, has a cost that does not appear on the balance sheet until it is due. The armies of the Holy League are growing. The French alliance Florence has staked its survival on is weakening. And the ordinary people whose sons now fill Machiavelli's citizen ranks are about to discover exactly what it costs when the grand strategies constructed in council chambers finally collide with the ground. Step back from the councils and the correspondence for a moment and look instead at what all of this actually meant for the people who never sat in a chancery office. Behind every diplomatic maneuver described so far is a countryside being repeatedly consumed by war. Consider the siege of Pisa itself, stretched across 15 years. This is not an abstract military campaign. It is farmland burned to deny the enemy its harvest, a city under blockade long enough that its own residents eventually offer surrender simply to end the starvation, and a rural Tuscan population conscripted, again and again, into Machiavelli's new militia, recruited from villages that had no say in the councils that decided their sons would fight. When Machiavelli praises the citizen soldier as morally superior to the mercenary, it is worth remembering that the citizen soldier still bleeds, still dies, still leaves a widow and children in Sant'Andrea or the Val di Pesa, who gain nothing from Florence's recovered pride except an empty place at the table. Consider Pistoia, the subject town Machiavelli was sent to pacify not once but twice, where factional violence killed neighbors who had grown up together, and where the eventual solution imposed from Florence, banishing the losing faction's leaders, was one Machiavelli himself privately opposed, believing exile without resolution simply exported the violence rather than ending it. Consider Arezzo, which rebelled and was punished, its ordinary residents caught between a Florentine government demanding loyalty and an invading army offering an alternative they had no real ability to evaluate before choosing sides. And consider Sinigalia's wider aftermath, because a captain's death by strangulation does not end with the captain. Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo commanded soldiers, and those soldiers had families in the towns those companies came from, families who received the news of a betrayal engineered specifically because it was efficient, not because it was just. None of this is described here to produce outrage as spectacle. It is described because Machiavelli's own writing, read honestly, rarely denies these costs. What his writing does is refuse to let them function as an argument. He treats the suffering of ordinary people during war and factional violence as a fact of political life to be managed and minimized, not eliminated. because in his account of history, it has never once been eliminated, only distributed differently depending on which system of power happens to be arranging the distribution. This is the quiet moral center of the whole story, delivered without a raised voice. Every prince Machiavelli studied, every republic he served, every system of government he would go on to recommend, ran on the same fuel, the bodies and labor of people who never chose the war they were asked to die in. He does not pretend this is good. He simply refuses to pretend it can be avoided by choosing kinder words instead of harder ones. Whether that refusal makes him more honest than his critics, or simply more resigned, is a question the story is not ready to answer yet. No figure in this story divides serious historians more cleanly than the man himself, and both sides deserve their strongest case, not their weakest. The critics begin with the historical record of horror his name has been used to justify. The Catholic Church placed The Prince on its list of banned books in 1559, and Catholic writers across the following century accused Machiavelli of teaching atheism disguised as statecraft. Leo Strauss, one of the most serious philosophers to study him in the 20th century, concluded flatly that Machiavelli was a teacher of evil, not because he was confused about morality, but because he understood it perfectly and set it aside anyway, treating cruelty and deception as ordinary tools rather than moral catastrophes. Frederick the Great of Prussia, a genuine monarch with genuine experience of statecraft, felt compelled to write an entire book, Anti-Machiavel, arguing against him. And history offers grim testimony for the critics. Benito Mussolini wrote admiringly of Machiavelli's influence on his own political method, and Joseph Stalin is reported to have kept an annotated personal copy of The Prince. When the word Machiavellian entered the English language as a synonym for manipulative cruelty, it did not arrive by accident. The defenders make an equally serious case, and it rests on a different set of facts entirely. Machiavelli spent almost his entire working life not advising princes but serving a republic, and his largest and most detailed political work, The Discourses on Livy, is not a manual for tyrants at all. It is an extended argument that free republics, not principalities, produce the greatest and most durable societies in history. He wrote there that cities only achieve lasting greatness while they remain at liberty, and that their fortunes decline the moment they fall under one-man rule. Centuries later, John Adams, a founder of the American Republic, studied Machiavelli closely and credited him with restoring empirical clarity to political thought, using his analysis of factional conflict to help design the American system of checks and balances. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci read Machiavelli as a covert democrat, arguing that The Prince was written not for princes at all, but for the common people, exposing to them exactly how princes operate so they could no longer be so easily ruled by illusions about virtue and legitimacy. Notice what both sides are actually arguing about, because it is not really a disagreement about the facts of Machiavelli's life. It is a disagreement about intention behind a text that never once announces its own purpose. Did a man who spent his career defending a republic write a handbook of tyranny out of desperate ambition for a job the Medici family would not give him? Or did a man who understood tyranny with total clarity write it down precisely so that free peoples would never again mistake a tyrant's charm for his character? The historical record supports both readings with roughly equal force, and that is exactly why the argument has lasted 500 years without resolution. This story will not resolve it either. But it is about to arrive at the moment in Machiavelli's own life when the theory he had spent a career refining stopped being an observation about other men's power, and became, without warning, the account of his own downfall. August of 1512. Everything Machiavelli has built for 14 years is about to collapse in a single season, and it happens with the speed of a trap closing rather than the slow decline of an empire. The Holy League, the Pope, Spain, Venice, has turned decisively against France, Florence's one remaining protector. Spanish troops, backed by the returning Medici family and their allies in Rome, march on the small Tuscan town of Prato, just outside Florence's own walls. The defense collapses almost immediately. Reports describe the sack of Prato as brutal, even by the standards of the age, and the psychological effect on Florence is immediate and total. The city's leadership, which had staked its survival on the militia Machiavelli spent 6 years building, watches that same militia prove unable to stop a determined foreign army from reaching its own front door. Piero Soderini, the gonfaloniere Machiavelli had served loyally for over a decade, resigns and flees into exile within days. The Republic Machiavelli had given his entire adult career to does not fall through slow decay. It falls in a single collapsing week, the way Machiavelli himself had always warned unprepared states eventually do. The Medici family, expelled from Florence 14 years earlier, walks back into the city they once ruled, almost without formal opposition. For a short time, Machiavelli tries to survive the transition the only way he knows how, through usefulness. He writes flattering verses. He attempts to make himself indispensable to the new regime, the same way he had made himself indispensable to the old one. It does not work. On the 7th of November 1512, he is dismissed from every office he has held. And then, in February of 1513, his name surfaces on a list connected to a conspiracy against the restored Medici government. A plot he almost certainly had no real part in, but proximity alone, in a moment of political paranoia, is enough. He is arrested and taken to the Bargello, Florence's prison and seat of civic justice. There, under interrogation, he is subjected to the strappado, bound by the wrists behind his back, hoisted by rope, and dropped, the weight of his own falling body dislocating his shoulders in their sockets. It is a short sentence to write, and an unbearable thing to endure. He confesses to nothing, because there is nothing true to confess, and after 3 weeks in a cell not knowing whether he will live or die, fortune, the same unpredictable current he had spent a career warning princes to prepare for, intervenes on his behalf instead of against it. Pope Julius II dies. His successor, Leo X, a member of the Medici family itself, declares a general amnesty to mark his own ascension. Machiavelli walks free on the 11th of March 1513, his body damaged, his career destroyed, his 14 years of service to the Florentine Republic reduced, in the eyes of the new regime, to a name on a suspect list. This is the moment everything changes, delivered with the pacing the moment deserves. No slow decline. A single season. A militia that could not hold. A patron who fled. A rope. And a man who had spent his whole intellectual life studying exactly how fortune destroys the unprepared, discovering, at 50 years old and hanging by his own dislocated shoulders, precisely what it feels like from the inside. Released, ruined, and unemployed, Machiavelli retreats to his family's small property at Sant'Andrea in Pecucina, in the hills south of the city he can no longer serve. What follows is not a dramatic reckoning in the way the word usually suggests. It is quieter, and in some ways crueler. Years of watching, from a farmhouse, the political life that had defined his entire adult identity continue without him. He describes his days in a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori that has survived to become one of the most quoted passages in Renaissance literature. Though its most famous lines cannot be reproduced here in full, only summarized honestly. By daylight, he manages his small estate among laborers and local tradesmen, arguing over lumber prices, playing cards in the village inn. But in the evening, he changes his clothes, puts on the formal dress of an ambassador, though he represents no one anymore, and shuts himself in his study to read the ancient historians, imagining himself in conversation with statesmen dead 1,000 years, the only company, he writes, that still feeds him. It is in this isolation, sometime around 1513, that he begins writing the short treatise that will define his entire reputation to history, The Prince. Its motive is not purely philosophical. He hopes, quite plainly, that its contents will demonstrate his usefulness to the Medici family clearly enough to earn him a position again. Any position. He is careful never to mention the Medici by name as tyrants, careful to frame the whole work as sincere counsel to a new ruler seeking to secure a state he has not inherited. He cites Cesare Borgia, the man he watched operate at Sinigalia a decade earlier, as the clearest example available of decisive, effective princely conduct. The reckoning here is not a single dramatic verdict. It is a slow, humiliating accumulation of silence. He sends an early draft to Vettori, who is impressed. He works for years refining it, hoping it will reach Giuliano de' Medici, and later the younger Lorenzo de' Medici, who eventually inherits control of Florence. When Machiavelli finally manages to deliver a dedicated copy of his life's most important political work in person, in 1516, Lorenzo has just received a pair of hunting dogs as a gift, and by every surviving account, pays the dogs considerably more attention than the manuscript. Something ends here, and something else survives. What ends is any realistic hope that theory alone, however sharp, however honest, could buy Machiavelli back the office his body had been broken to protect. What survives is the manuscript itself, unpublished in his lifetime, circulating quietly among friends, waiting on a shelf for a future it cannot yet know is coming. Machiavelli, humiliated by dogs, has no way of knowing that the very document Lorenzo ignored is about to outlive every regime that ever employed or imprisoned him, and that its true audience was never actually sitting in that room at all. Step back now from Machiavelli the man and look at what his entire story exposes about the institutions that produced, employed, and eventually discarded him, because this is where a biography becomes something closer to political philosophy. Florence, for all its wealth and cultural brilliance, was never structurally equipped to survive the century it lived through. Its government changed form repeatedly within a single lifetime. Republic, theocracy, republic again, principality, republic again, because it had built no durable mechanism for resolving factional conflict short of exile, execution, or foreign intervention. Machiavelli watched this cycle from inside the chancery for 14 years and diagnosed its central weakness with total clarity. A state that depends on rented soldiers and borrowed alliances has effectively outsourced its own survival, and a state whose factions cannot share power without eventually purging one another will always be one crisis away from inviting outside force to settle what its own citizens could not. This is not a uniquely Florentine problem, and Machiavelli did not believe it was. Every republic he studied in the discourses, Rome above all, survived precisely as long as it managed to convert internal conflict into productive friction rather than destructive purges. And it began to die the moment ambition outpaced the institutions built to contain it. The vulnerability his story exposes is structural, not personal. Republics fail not usually because their citizens stop wanting liberty, but because liberty requires constant, unglamorous maintenance. Militias trained rather than rented, factions balanced rather than crushed, institutions strengthened in years of peace so they can survive the wars that inevitably follow. When you hear a modern leader promise to restore order through strength alone, you are hearing an argument with roots that reach directly back to this failure. The belief that a single decisive figure, willing to act outside conventional restraint, can substitute for the slower, harder work of building institutions that do not depend on any one person's virtue at all. Machiavelli's own answer to the crisis he witnessed was not, in the end, a call for more princes. It was a call for citizens armed, trained, and invested enough in their own governance that no single collapse, no single Sinigalia, no single rope in the bargello could take the whole system down with it. The uncomfortable question the Florentine collapse leaves behind is this: institutions built by frightened people in a crisis rarely survive contact with the next one, because crisis-built institutions are optimized for the crisis that built them, not for the ones still to come. Florence built a chancery, a militia, and a shifting cast of governing councils in reaction to whatever emergency was most recent. Savonarola, Pisa, the French, the Medici, and each new emergency found new gaps the last reform had not anticipated. Machiavelli's writing is, in this light, less a celebration of ruthless princes than a diagnosis of institutional fragility, delivered by a man who had personally paid, in dislocated shoulders and a ruined career, for every gap his republic never managed to close in time. Machiavelli died in Florence on the 21st of June, 1527, at 58 years old, only weeks after the republic he had once served was briefly restored and the Medici expelled once more, a restoration that came too late and left him too closely associated with the family he had spent his final years courting to be given any place in it. He was buried in the church of Santa Croce, where he now rests within a few steps of Michelangelo and Galileo, three men Florence eventually chose to honor long after failing, in life, to fully use any of them. What survived him did not stay quiet for long. The Prince, published 5 years after his death, spread across Europe with a speed that terrified the very institutions meant to guard public morality. By the time the Catholic Church formally banned it in 1559, editions were already circulating in Italian and French translation among the same royal courts that publicly condemned it. Thomas Cromwell, the chief minister to England's Henry VIII, reportedly admired the book. Catherine de' Medici carried its reputation, fairly or not, into the French court, associated forever after with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Catholic writers accused Machiavelli of teaching Protestant kings to sin freely, while Protestant writers accused him of teaching Catholic kings the same lesson. He had, somehow, become useful to everyone who wanted to justify what they were already planning to do. The shadow reaches further than any single court. Francis Bacon named Machiavelli as a direct forerunner of the modern scientific method itself, for insisting on describing what men actually do rather than what moralists wished they did. Centuries later, in the young United States, John Adams studied Machiavelli's account of factional conflict so closely that it shaped his argument for a government of carefully balanced, competing powers rather than one built on the hope of universal virtue. Antonio Gramsci, writing from a fascist prison in the 20th century, read Machiavelli as a hidden ally of ordinary people against the princes who ruled them. And Benito Mussolini, ruling from the other side of that same century, wrote his own essay praising Machiavelli's influence on his methods of control. You do not have to read a 500-year-old Italian treatise to feel this shadow today. Every time a political consultant tells a candidate that appearing strong matters more than being right, you are hearing an argument Machiavelli made explicit first. Every time a government justifies a harsh policy as an unfortunate necessity rather than a moral choice, it is using a form of reasoning he gave a name to 5 centuries ago. Every time the phrase, "the ends justify the means," gets attributed to him, incorrectly, since he never wrote that exact sentence, it is a sign of how completely his name has become shorthand for an entire way of thinking about power that predates him and will certainly outlive this documentary as well. The callback worth noticing here, the boy legally excluded from Florentine office because of his father's debts, became, after his death, one of the most cited authorities on how office actually functions, studied by kings, presidents, dictators, and democrats alike. The door that was locked to him in life never fully closed again for anyone who read what he wrote about it. Every serious study of Machiavelli eventually arrives at the same fork, and 500 years of scholarship has not managed to close it, because Machiavelli himself never closed it. Here is the fork. If a writer describes exactly how tyranny operates, its patience, its use of apparent mercy as a weapon, its willingness to treat betrayal as simply another tool available to a sufficiently prepared prince, has that writer made tyranny easier by handing its methods to anyone ambitious enough to use them? Or has that writer made tyranny harder by permanently stripping away the myths a tyrant depends on to seem inevitable, virtuous, or divinely favored? A citizenry that has read The Prince cannot be as easily fooled by a leader who claims his cruelty is regrettable necessity, rather than calculated strategy. But a citizenry that has read The Prince has also been handed, in exact and reusable form, a working blueprint for exactly the kind of ruler it claims to want to resist. Machiavelli's own life offers evidence for both readings and settles neither. He spent 14 years defending a republic, was tortured by the regime that replaced it, and then spent his final years writing advice for the very family responsible for his ruin. Advice that, if followed, would have made that family's rule more secure, not less. Was this the calculated flattery of a desperate, unemployed man trying to feed his family, stripped of any deeper conviction? Or was it something closer to a diagnosis delivered to the only patient willing to read it, regardless of whether the diagnosis came from love or self-interest? There is a version of this question that applies well beyond 16th century Florence, and it is the one worth sitting with longest. Can a free society survive being told the truth about how power actually works, the bargaining, the calculated cruelty, the careful management of appearances that holds even the most legitimate governments together? Or does that society need at least some of its founding illusions intact, simply to keep functioning at all? Machiavelli seemed to believe, at least in the discourses, that liberty survives longest precisely when citizens understand power without illusion, because illusion is what tyrants exploit most efficiently. But The Prince, written by the same hand only a few years earlier, reads at times like an instruction manual for exactly the kind of illusion-exploiting ruler the discourses warn against. Perhaps the truest answer is that Machiavelli never fully decided which book he believed in more, and that the 5 centuries of argument that followed him are simply the argument he was already having with himself, played out across the reading lists of kings, dictators, and democracies that all, in their own way, needed him to be right. Return, one last time, to that farmhouse in the hills above San Cassiano, years after the rope, years after the dogs ignored his manuscript, years after every door in Florence had closed against him. Picture the ordinary daylight hours first. A man in muddy work clothes, arguing prices with a woodcutter, playing cards with the local innkeeper, indistinguishable from any other minor landowner scraping by in the Tuscan countryside. Nothing in those daylight hours suggests a man who will still be read 5 centuries later by people running nations he never heard of. Then picture the evening. The threshold of his study becomes something closer to a border crossing than a doorway. He removes the muddy clothes of the man Florence no longer employs. He puts on the clothing of an ambassador, a role no government has offered him in years, and steps inside to a room lined with the historians and statesmen of a Rome that stopped existing over 1,000 years before he was born. He greets them, by his own account, as old friends. He asks them questions about power, about ruin, about the exact mechanics of how free peoples lose what they built. And for 4 hours at a time, he writes, he forgets he is poor. He forgets he was tortured. He forgets that the family he is courting with his most careful, most dangerous ideas has not written back. Look now at what that private, humiliated ritual actually produced. A man with no office invented, in that lamplit room, a vocabulary for power that outlasted every government that ever employed or discarded him. The Medici family, who could not spare him a job, are remembered today in large part because of the book he wrote hoping to win one back. The republic that tortured him on suspicion of a plot he had no part in is remembered, in no small measure, through the eyes of the very clerk it broke. Every president who has quietly kept a copy of The Prince on a private shelf, every strategist who has justified a hard choice as necessary rather than good, every reader who has ever felt the particular discomfort of recognizing themselves in a philosophy they wanted to reject outright, all of them are, in some sense, still standing at the threshold of that farmhouse study, watching a ruined man change his clothes to speak with the dead because the living would no longer listen. He wanted, more than anything else his writing reveals, to be let back into the room. He never was, and so he built one instead, out of paper, out of borrowed authority from historians 1,000 years gone, out of nothing but a locked door and the refusal to stop describing, in exhausting and unbearable detail, exactly how it worked. History remembers him not for the office he was denied, but for the room he built when denial was the only material left to build with. Somewhere, tonight, in an office of actual consequence, someone is quietly deciding whether to be loved or feared. And however they decide, the man who first insisted they would eventually have to choose is still, in his own way, in the room.